Hello, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. My name is Shataz Chaudhry. I'm in the team with Winston, Steve, Arif, and Lenti. And today we are presenting on Sport Obermeyer, which is a fashion ski apparel business. And the case that took place was actually in 1992, and which brings us to our critical issue, which is how many women's parkas should Sport Obermeyer Limited produce in their initial production run for the 1993 to 1994 line. So I'm going to hand it over to Arif, who's going to talk about a couple of critical facts for you guys.
Thank you, Shataz. So moving on to the critical facts of the case. First things first, Wally has requested individual forecasts for the initial production from each manager in the buying committee. Another fact is that women's parkas represent 10% of Obermeyer's 200,000 parkas production, and there are 10 different styles of women's parkas. Also, 80% of Obermeyer's annual orders are received the week following the Las Vegas show. Moving on to overproduction, the cost for overproduction is 8% the wholesale price of each parka. So for example, if a parka costs $112.50, 8% of that would be $9 lost per parka for overproduction. Now with overproduction, there's also underproduction. So the underproduction cost is 24% of the wholesale price, again, of each parka. Moving on, there's a Hong Kong and China debate on where to produce the parkas. So for Hong Kong, they have a higher labor cost, whereas China has a lower labor cost. Also, Hong Kong has a minimum production quantity of 600 units in the same style of each parka, whereas China has a minimum production quantity of 1,200 units, again, in the same style. So as you can see, Hong Kong has a significantly lower minimum production quantity. Moving on, Obermeyer has produced about 200,000 parkas each year. Also, the maximum capacity for all plants cutting and sewing was 30,000 units a month. And the last fact, Colorado is a sole receiver and distributor of the manufactured parkas. So we're getting all the parkas received to Colorado, and we're also distributing from the same place in Colorado. Now, I'm going to be passing it over to Steve, who will be discussing the analysis of the case.
Okay, thank you, Arif. I'm Steve Balkaran, and I'll be doing the first part of the analysis. In this exhibit, it shows Sports Obermeyer initial forecast, their final forecast, and the actual amount of the demand of one style of parka. So in the first forecast, the company forecasted a demand of 2,500 units for just one style of parka, which we'll be referring to as parka A. In the final forecast, however, the forecasted amount was changed to 500 units. As it turns out, the actual demand was 510. The final forecast was way closer and more accurate to the actual demand, whereas the first forecast was over 409% the actual demand. The reason for this glaring inaccuracy is that for the first forecast, the company had very little information and data about how much of a particular style of parka it will sell. Whereas for the final forecast, the company had more data and information about what the demand would be, so the forecast was more accurate. Let's take a look at the forecast each of the 6 managers created for the 10 different styles of parka Obermeyer would produce for the 1993 to 1994 line. This is the first forecast that was created, so it is very likely that this forecast is not accurate. Anyway, in the first column on the left-hand side is the list of the 10 styles of parka to produce. And in the second row at the top, you will see the names of the 6 managers. A quick example. As you can see, the manager Laura forecasted the demand for the Gale parka to be 900. and you can check each manager's forecast. In the highlighted column to the right here is the average forecast for each Parker using the 6 managers forecast. So this is the buying committee's forecast. The sum of the average forecast for each style is at the bottom of that column, which ended up being a total of 20,000, which is the total amount of women's Parker Obermeyer will produce. Now keep in mind that we only need to order at least 10,000 Parkers for our initial production. So the first thing we did was calculate the coefficient of variation for each style of Parker using 2 times the standard deviation, since the demand from previous years shows that the standard deviation was actually twice that of the buying committee's forecast. To find the coefficient of variation, we simply did 2 times the standard deviation divided by the average forecast. This coefficient of variation is a measure of the risk associated with each Parker's average forecast. We categorize each Parker's coefficient of variation into 2 groups. Anything above 50%, we consider it to be very risky forecast, and anything below, any coefficient of variation below 50% to be not risky forecast. We then use this information to order 80% of the styles of Parker that were not risky, and we decided to order 20% of the styles of Parker that were risky. So for example, the Gale Parker were not risky because the coefficient of variation was 38.15%. So we ordered 80% of the average forecast, which is 80% of 1017, which gives us 813.6. For the ICE Parker, which is risky because the coefficient of variation is 62%, we only ordered 20% of the average forecast, which is 20% of 1042, which turned out to be 208.4. We then rounded up any number since we can't order a piece of a Parker. The sum of this forecast turned out to be 9,804 Parkers. As you can see at the very bottom of the adjusted amount column, which is only around 200 less than the minimum number of Parkers we need to order for our first production run. I will now hand the rest of the analysis over to Winston.
Thank you, Steve. So now we're going to be discussing the differences in manufacturing in Hong Kong as opposed to manufacturing in China. So this plays a significant role towards our critical issue as it dictates how many of each style should we order, and therefore how many of each style will then change the total amount of women's parkas that are ordered. This is because there's a factor called minimum order quantity. This is the lowest or the baseline amount that must be created in order for each location to actually create that style. So on the Hong Kong side, there's a lower minimum order quantity. They require that there's at least 600 of each style that is created. On the other hand, there's China, which has a higher minimum order quantity. They demand that at least 1,200 of each style is created. Like I said, this ultimately changes that minimum amount that we create for each style, and once again changes the total amount of women's parkas there are. On top of this, on the Hong Kong side, there's lower repairs, so it's less likely to be having errors in these parkas, as opposed to China that has higher repair rates. They have more mistakes within their parkas. On the Hong Kong side, there's a higher labor cost, so you have to pay each employee a higher wage. On top of this, they can't work so many hours per week. They have a lower working hour per week, unlike China. China pays less, and at the same time, you have to work more hours per week. The final differentiating part is the method of delivery. So on the Hong Kong side, the method of delivery is through ocean carrier freight. They can move by boat and it takes a longer time to get to the destination. As opposed to China, all exports from China must be transported via air freight, so they must be flown in and therefore have a faster lead time. Now, if we move to the next slide, you can see our recommended decision. Therefore, our final consensus is that the initial production run for this 1993 to 1994 line should consist of 11,075 women's parkas, split between the styles of 814 for Gale, 600 for Isis, 1087 for Antis, 2020 for Assault, 600 for Terry, 880 for Electra, 600 for Stephanie, 3,214 for Seduced, 660 for Initia, and 600 for Daphne. As some of you noticed by now, those numbers that we have for Isis, for Terry, for Electra, and Daphne are different from the numbers that Steve originally talked about. The reason for this is because those numbers previously were lower than 600. However, we must raise those styles in order to meet a minimum order quantity so that we can produce. Fortunately for us, we can choose between Hong Kong or China. So therefore, we choose the lesser of those minimum order quantities, and we raised it to the baseline amount of 600 for the styles of Isis, for Terry, for Stephanie, and Daphne. Now, I will pass it on to Lenti that will further explain the effectiveness of our recommended decision.
Thank you, Winston. Hello, everyone. So I will be discussing the effectiveness of our recommended decision. So why should Sports Obermeyer produce what Winston stated previously? Why should they do what we suggest and not base their initial production on their already existing forecasts? Well, the short answer to that is because they will save a lot of money by following our recommendation. Their already existing forecast is shown in the first column from the left, labeled as average forecast on the spreadsheet. This was a forecast that was shown in the case for the whole production of 20,000 units. This forecast did not take into account crucial aspects such as the initial run of a minimum of 10,000 units and the fact that there are minimum order quantities in place on where we decide to produce, either China or Hong Kong. So we went ahead and accounted for these aspects on the column that is titled Adjusted for 10,000 in the spreadsheet. Now this adjusted forecast is prior to accounting for the variability incurred between forecasts. As Steve mentioned earlier, this variability plays a significant factor in our initial production run. The coefficient of variation is shown here as high risk ratios, which are highlighted in yellow, and low risk ratios, which are highlighted in blue. In our recommended forecast, we do take into account this risk, which will ultimately determine our order quantity. Now, why do we do this? Because if we overproduce the demand, then we lose money by having to sell to retailers at a salvage value, which is a lower price. We lose about 8% of the price per parka if this scenario happens. And if we underproduce, we also miss out on potential profit, which would be 24% per parka. So therefore, by ordering less when the risk is high and by ordering more when the risk is low, we avoid the costs that I mentioned above. The other half of the spreadsheet shows us precisely how we avoid these costs. First, we calculated all the units that would not end up being produced if the manager's forecast is followed instead of our forecast. These are units that represent low risk, since most of the managers are in general agreement about the potential demand for them. If these units would not be produced, then the company would miss out on the opportunity to make $42,907. This is the first number highlighted in red. If our forecast is followed, then $42,907 would be potentially made as profit. Second, we calculated all the units that would end up being produced if our forecast was not followed. These are units that represent a high risk, since most of the managers are in disagreement about the initial demand for them. If these units would be produced, then Sports Obermeyer would incur a loss of $14,360 as a result of having to sell them for salvage value to retailers. This is the second number highlighted in red on the spreadsheet. So now that we have shown you why the amount we recommend to produce is effective, we will show you why the locations we recommend to produce will be effective as well. So as we stated before, Sports Obermeyer has two locations where their parkas are manufactured, China and Hong Kong. In our recommended decision, we suggested that they produce their parkas in a specific mix between Hong Kong and China. So the question arises, why should Sports Obermeyer not produce all their parkas in China? Or why not produce all of them in Hong Kong? This slide will help us understand why our recommended way of production is much more efficient than the alternatives. As you probably already noticed, in this slide, we are comparing theoretical income statements. If the parkas were all produced in Hong Kong versus if the parkas were produced in both Hong Kong and China, like we recommend they should. Now, there's a major reason why we are not comparing our recommendation to the possibility of all the parkas being produced in China. Having the initial production of parkas all come from China would simply be very inefficient. The minimum order quantity of 1,200 parkas per style that China has in place defeats the whole purpose of even having a forecast, since every order quantity would have to be automatically increased to 1,200. And if we order over 1,200 units of each parka style, we will inevitably end up with an excess amount of parkas that will increase inventory and holding costs tremendously. So with that being said, now we will explore the efficiency of the two feasible alternatives. We went ahead and calculated the potential revenue from our initial order sales for both of these alternatives. Then we went ahead and calculated the expenses in total landed costs, ocean carrier freight, and air freight for each scenario. And what we have left is a gross profit for each alternative. By following our recommended decision, Sports Obermeyer end up earning roughly $24,000 in profit, more than they would if they just produced all their parkas in Hong Kong. The reason why the profits would be greater with our recommended decision is because we end up saving the company money in expenses by having the styles of parkas that exceed 1,200 units to be produced in China and the rest of the styles to be produced in Hong Kong. So, once again, why should Sport Obermeyer do what we recommend? Because our production quantity takes in consideration the risk involved with each prediction. Accounting for this risk will help the company save $14,360 from overproducing, and $42,907 will be earned from avoiding underproduction. Last but not least, our recommended route of production leads to roughly $24,000 more in gross profit than the other alternative. Now I will pass it on to Arif, who will talk about the execution.
So moving on to the execution. Now, a key thing that you got to remember is that this is all for the initial production run and prior to the Las Vegas show. So the design process, the sketches, the prototype production will not be changed and have the same schedule from February to September. So the design process will start in February, the sketches will be done in July, prototype production will be in September. In November, we will order the first production that we stated previously. Once we receive the order, we will calculate the fabric and component requirements, order components, place print and die orders during the December and February months, which is up until the Las Vegas show. So basically everything is what we were doing before, except the initial production quantity will be changed. Now, for this year, we were told to assume that everything will be produced in Hong Kong. But for future years, based on what is optimal, we would decide which style should be produced in Hong Kong and China. So the process changes a little bit different. The design process, sketches, and prototype will all be the same, but we will, based on what is optimal, we'll decide which style should be produced in the specific country, either Hong Kong or China, based on the factors of labor costs and minimum order quantity, which was stated previously. So once we decide that, we factor in the minimum quantity order for Hong Kong and China for each parka and adjust the quantities accordingly based on the minimum order quantity for each country. Now, depending on where the orders are being produced, that data will be moved to their own respective system. So there would be one for China for the parkas produced in China, and then one for Hong Kong for the parkas that would be produced in Hong Kong. Now, once you have this data in a system, this will help with determining the second production quantity as well as future orders for years to come. So it will help in the future after the Las Vegas show, and then you can see future years this information and then the actual forecast of what it was and use that to determine a more accurate forecast for future years. I'm now going to be passing it to Shataz, who will be discussing the scenario planning.
Great, thank you. So even with foolproof planning, we can still come across a lot of problems. So here we're presenting you with 3 problems and a couple of possible solutions along with it. So the first scenario I have here is overproduction. That makes an expected loss of about 8% of the wholesale price per parka. And the way we want to deal with it is by developing alliances with a greater range of retailers. The second scenario I have here is underproduction of parkas, which is also due to incorrect forecasting. And parkas that are sold make 24% profit per parka. And we're missing out on all these potential customers this way. So a potential solution would be that the retailers are asked to put in their individual forecast before the Vegas show, even if it's in a smaller order, but we still need some sort of idea to go base off of it. And having safety stock for replenishing orders is so important as well in this case. Last but not least, lateness of raw materials and garments. What we need to understand is that we have a lot of suppliers from all over the world, and we need to recognize the reliable ones and the unreliable ones. And we need to discontinue with the unreliable ones and continue working with the reliable suppliers. And we also need to give a lot more priority to air freight for late orders. All right, so that's it to wrap our case up. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to stick around, and we hope that our recommendations are going to help the company. Thank you so much.